Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristin Skinstad from the Kooij, as was just mentioned. I work at the Institute of International Studies of the Faculty of Education at Oslo University College. My talk today is going to be on history education as intercultural education. And I will talk about this also by speaking about collaboration between schools and musea and memorial places. Thus, my talk will pick up on some of the themes from yesterday's panel discussion, as you may notice when I go through it. Sure. Okay, thank you. And what an amazing place to be studying intercultural history education. I'm here at this museum for the first time, and I was lucky enough to be able to join the tour read by Professor Barbara Kirchenblatt-Gimblett on Monday, and I am completely, how should I put it, blown away by this institution, which is really, I think, a laboratory for learning about intercultural history education, and I'm trying to learn as much as I can while I'm here. A little bit more about my background. I'm also affiliated with the Nordic Center of Excellence called Justice Through Education in the Nordic Countries. And my field is critical multicultural education. I research and lecture about teaching and learning in multicultural societies and the role of education in society. And I do this in a master's program in multicultural and international education. We engage with history education because we find that our students need knowledge about intercultural relations historically and understanding of narratives about these relations to understand intercultural relations in the present. Our program is an international program for teachers and other education professionals. Students from all over the world enroll in our classes. We currently have 12 nationalities represented in our first-year class of about 35 students. Intercultural learning is this part of our daily work. And as is widely recognized and shown by research in our field, intercultural learning in international and multicultural classrooms does not happen automatically. These classes need to be developed into what has been called internationalized or intercultural classrooms, places where different cultures meet and learn from each other. A few years ago, a group of our students was invited to participate in the International History Education Project, developing competence-oriented teaching on historical memories, TeachMem for short. I will return to this project later in the presentation. Through this project, which involved several people who are present at this conference, I learned about collaborative work in history education between educators in schools, universities, and musea and memorial places. Such cooperation is a theme running through this presentation. When I became familiar with the TeachMem project, we had been working at my college program, had been working on developing cooperative partnerships between schools and teachers and public libraries in order to develop intercultural literacy education. This project was developed by my colleague, Professor Sjur. And the project was based on the idea that the shared mandate of libraries and schools to promote literacy, empowerment, and democratic citizenship could be a focal point for collaborative work on the shared object of literacy education and empowerment. The richness of the resources found in libraries, the competence of librarians to match readers in literature, and the library as a learning space which is voluntary, open to all, and not charged with grading performance and sorting students according to ability, represent resources which can help teachers develop intercultural literacy education to reach all students. And I see several parallels to musea and memorial sites. And I'm very excited that this was also mentioned yesterday in the panel discussion. And I'm looking forward to continue that conversation. Musea and memorial sites in schools also share a mandate, and that is to educate young people for sustainable democracy. The Council of Europe recommendation of the Committee of Ministers to Member States on Intercultural Dialogue and the Image of the Other in History Teaching includes a section on the development of partnership between schools and institutions contributing to lifelong learning of history, such as musea and memorial sites. Stakeholders are encouraged in this document to develop educational services, particularly in history museums, and arrange joint training courses for teachers and the organizers of these educational services in order to ensure coherence as regards objectives and methods and familiarization with the potential, but also the difficulties of implementing partnerships. I believe that there's great potential in such cooperation. And I think it goes beyond ensuring coherence and familiarization with methods. There's great potential in such cooperation in the area of intercultural history education. Institutions such as the ones you represent, those of you from the museums and memorial sites who are here, reach millions of students each year. And a close cooperation might lead to professional development both in schools and teacher education and in musea and memorial sites, which we could call expansive learning, as well as enhanced history education, intercultural history education. Within each type of institution, professionals draw on different professional knowledge and resources and are also limited by particular institutional, economic, and political frameworks. For teachers, these are, among others, curricula and assessment requirements, teaching materials, teacher knowledge, and traditions of involving or not involving other professional groups in pedagogical work in schools. Before moving on to talk about intercultural education, I will briefly return to the aforementioned recommendation. This document lists the skills, abilities, and attitudes linked to the learning of the history of others. I'm going to read the list of skills that they mention. Interest and curiosity about history, overall awareness of the interdependence of cultures, receptiveness to the cultures and convictions of others, ability to perceive cultural diversity as a shared asset, ability to position one's own culture in a broader context, ability to identify stereotypes and prejudices, ability to hear and respect other viewpoints and be amenable to dialogue, ability to control one's emotions and accept when other people express theirs, ability to distinguish what pertains to the facts of history from judgments or interpretations of it, and as a result come to their own conclusions, ability to construct recent critical judgments, and ability to comprehend, compare, and analyze sources of different kinds and origins. I will relate particularly to the ability to construct recent critical judgments. My talk today roughly has 3 parts. I'm going to talk about intercultural education on the macro level, about history education in light of intercultural competence, and lastly, about cooperation between teachers and educators from musea and memorial sites. On the level of intercultural policy, or international policy rather, the importance of intercultural education and teaching intercultural competences is accepted. In the Pestalozzi program publication, Intercultural Competence for All, it is put like this: intercultural education and the teaching of intercultural competence can no longer be regarded as a mere add-on to the curriculum in occasional projects, but it must be extended and eventually replace the monocultural, monolingual setting of our schools and lead to a change of mindset in traditional education. Education professionals are encouraged to work creatively and cooperatively towards change by focusing on school practice, whether the classroom or within the school as a whole, and to develop new methods and practices of teaching and learning in the classroom. In many countries, significant gains have been made in the field of intercultural education. Academics in education have been arguing for the centrality of intercultural education for decades. David Colby, for example, a British scholar, has written, if education is not intercultural, it is probably not education, but rather the inculcation of nationalist or religious fundamentalism. However, education is embedded in the struggles for power, which permeate the societies of which it is part, and intercultural policies are often contested. There is a tendency to regard the consideration of cultural diversity and multiculturalism in education to be discriminatory or even racist sometimes, and to instead develop policy around individual needs and individual rights, and to measure quality in education in terms of individual achievement, disregarding the continued reproduction of inequality and monocultural content in education systems. In actual classroom practice, working to achieve intercultural education is an ongoing struggle, just like becoming interculturally competent is a lifelong project. We will never arrive at the goal because the goal itself is in flux and impossible to describe fully and precisely. Practicing intercultural education, or learning to become interculturally competent, is a process, and the point is to recognize the challenges and continue to strive for it as an ideal. There are also ongoing discussions about what intercultural education is, and we saw an example of this yesterday in our panel discussion. Intercultural education is being criticized for being depoliticized, for reducing intercultural competence to knowledge about surface-level cultural facts, about samosas, saris, and steel bands, to quote a colleague, and for disguising conquest, slave trade, genocide, and struggles for justice, which have often been the reality of intercultural encounters. Before I continue, I will mention 3 terms that are often used when talking about intercultural relations: diversity, otherness, and difference. These words are often used as synonyms, but the meaning of these words may change as they travel across different policy traditions, different academic traditions, and so on. And I think it's important to reflect on the meaning of those terms and how they can be interpreted in different contexts. Gerard Neuner wrote about them in the Pestalozzi program publication, Intercultural Competence for All, and he wrote, diversity refers to the observation of variation within a larger group that shares a common basis. It implies neighborhood, openness, acceptance, and inclusion, while otherness presupposes comparison with an emphasis on difference and refers to oppositeness. A community emphasis on otherness might lead to demarcation and prejudice, which could be the appreciation or depreciation of subgroups, as well as the emergence of discrimination and exclusion. The concept of diversity is seen, or the idea of diversity is seen as characteristic of us. And being included in us does not deny diversity. The concept of the diversity allows us to speak about variation within. However, being labeled different might mean being defined as other and too diverse to be tolerated. But I would also like to mention that the concept of diversity is also associated sometimes with a neoliberal shift away from group rights, such as rights to language and religious practice, and toward a focus on individual rights and choice. Diversity is a concept which allows us to include human variation in all its broadness. However, we must not use it to avoid engaging with experiences of oppression and exploitation. I would like to suggest looking to philosopher Nancy Fraser when looking for a thorough discussion on questions of multiculturalism and justice. She has a pragmatic approach, which I find very compelling. She says that the kinds of wrongs that are to be righted, historical wrongs, for example, oppression, the kinds of issues that are in the way of justice, standing in the way of justice, will have to determine the kinds of policies needed to achieve justice. So her philosophy can be, or her argument is that sometimes multicultural policies may be the ones that are needed to achieve justice, while at other times policies that ensure the redistribution of wealth, for example, or policies designed to promote equality between the genders may be more appropriate than multicultural policies in other contexts. So it's not a question of either or. Now, the second part of my talk goes more into the critical developments within the field of intercultural education and history education. In the abstract for this thematic block, the need for the development of intercultural competence is connected to the encounter and interaction with what is experienced as different. Intercultural history education classrooms are places where such encounters happen, and when dealt with in a critical intercultural way, may lead to more than token knowledge about the other. I'd like to mention an example which is familiar, I think, to all of us. There was recently in the news media in Norway, I heard it on the radio program, examples of teachers in Norway experiencing that pupils in their classrooms protest when the teachers talk about the Holocaust. And this is something that we have recently also experienced in our college classes. And these reactions or these protests often come from pupils whose backgrounds are from countries or places where the history of the Second World War has not been processed and discussed in the same way that we have been doing, where our teachers come from. These classrooms provide both opportunities for the learning of intercultural competences, which young people will need in their future lives as adult citizens in diverse European societies. And intercultural classes also, of course, demand special attention to variation in prior knowledge and experiences and attitudes which students bring to the classroom. For my discussion of the teaching and learning of history in multicultural classes, I use Marie-Louise Pratt's concept of contact zone to describe the particular conditions of encounter and interaction educators might find in such classes. The contact zone refers to, I quote, social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, and their aftermaths, as they are lived out in many parts of the world today. Now, just a word of caution. This is a definition that can be accused of being a culturalizing or definition or reifying cultures. Of course, we're not talking about cultures that meet, we're talking about individuals that meet. And people who identify with the same cultural groups or who are identified with such groups, of course, will have differing experiences and knowledge and positions. So we need to be aware of these culturalist understandings. For our purposes, we can add differing memory cultures among Europeans about the Second World War, for example. But for our purposes, the reason why I use this concept is because it does talk about intercultural encounters in spaces or in groups where there are differences in power relations and where people bring different historical baggage to the discussions. And these differences in knowledge and experiences may lead to different interpretation of the same historical events, like the example I just mentioned. Learning about the other and learning intercultural competences will therefore need to be accompanied by confronting these power differences and differing experiences in a psychosocially safe environment, and with teaching methods that open for dialogue and multi-perspectivity. And this week we'll explore such methods where diversity in the history education classroom becomes a resource for learning of intercultural competences. Contact zones are not comfort zones. They're challenging and therefore bearing learning potential, since learning presupposes an encounter with something as yet unknown. In order to develop critical thinking skills, this encounter with the as yet unknown is invaluable in having another perspective and relativizing one's own perspectives and realizing what we take for granted. In a critical perspective, in the sense of critical theory, critical education work does not end with the individual developing critical thinking skills and the ability to recognize stereotypes and execute independent judgment. It also seeks to address the reproduction of inequality and oppression and work for change. So, I'm moving on now to the last part, which brings me into the cooperation again. The Council of Europe's Training and Capacity Building Program for Education Professionals, the Pestalozzi program, together with the Intercultural Cities program and the European Wergeland Center, co-organized a think tank to develop the Intercultural Competences tool, recognizing intercultural competence. And I looked at this when I revisited it. I've been fortunate enough to become familiar with the tool through training programs in the Pestalozzi program, and I revisited the tool now to try to look for some definitions of what intercultural competence might be that we would like, that we can base our discussions on throughout these days. The purpose of this tool is to help people who are learning intercultural competences recognize these competences in themselves. And the tool is a list of I statements about observable behaviors, and the statements are categorized as attitudes, knowledge, or skills. Each of these is broken down into several areas of attitudes, knowledge, and skills that research and development work have shown to be parts of intercultural competence. And I recommend this tool as a place to start when looking for when you're teaching to promote intercultural competence, what might it be? What might it look like? And as an example, I will look at one part of the tool, which is critical thinking skills. I chose this because critical thinking skills is important an important skill to be developed in the study of history, as we have also just seen. In this tool, critical thinking is operationalized as follows. I use all available information and my analytical skills to verify my interpretations. I question the interpretations offered by others, including authority figures or authoritative sources. I offer different ways of interpreting the ideas and actions of people. I give clear arguments to explain my thoughts and choices. These are also skills that are found in history curricula. Developing analytical skills is integral to historical competence. In order to be able to question the interpretations offered by others, including authority figures or authoritative sources, and offer different ways of interpreting, students need knowledge about historical events and relations between groups historically, and about narratives about history, historical memory, and how they function in the present to maintain or question power relations. Now, this is a very complex task to achieve for a teacher or any teacher of history working with traditional classroom methods and drawing on traditional school resources. I would like to just briefly comment on the relationship between the academic discipline of history, as this was also a question raised in the abstract for this block. What is historical science? I'm not a historian, so I'm commenting on this from the perspective of somebody in pedagogy. The epistemological perspectives which guide knowledge development in the academic discipline of history also has an influence on the teaching of history in schools and vice versa. Which questions historians ask, which methods they use, and which theoretical concepts they use to interpret their findings has a bearing on what knowledge is available for school teachers to share with their students. Of course, historical research and curriculum development are also influenced by other factors such as political interests. In the following, I base my description on the work of my colleague Tore Linné Eriksen, who is a global historian and author of several history textbooks. He taught me that Vasco da Gama did not find the sea route to India on his own, which is what I taught what I learned when I went to school, and what I discovered that my daughter is still learning at school. He taught me that he met somebody on the east coast of Africa when he got that far, whose name was Ibn Majid. And Ibn Majid helped Vasco da Gama find his way to India. And there is a vital difference, I think, between these two narratives. And this knowledge about Vasco da Gama's route travels to India is coming out of the field of global history, which challenges historical research traditions which have often been limited to the history of national states, regions, or continents. From a European perspective, global history seeks to provincialize Europe, as is said by the Indian scholar Dipesh Chakrabarti. And that, what is meant by that is to get away from a Eurocentric focus in history and historical research. Global history is not satisfied to study the development of a nation without seeing it in connection to the rest of the world. Typical topics are trade, migration, slavery, the spread of ideas, and religious impulses. Global history looks for connections and is often comparative. And global history seeks to decolonize history. In my view, this school of history lends itself to intercultural history teaching. Another example from my home country that I would like to mention is a large-scale history project led by historian Knut Kjelsali. He and his team of historians wrote the history of Norway from the point of view of immigrants and immigration. And through his work, they documented the long history of diversity in Norway, countering the hegemonic narrative about Norway as a homogeneous nation until the labor migrants arrived in the late 1960s. Both of these examples provide alternatives to a history education characterized by relating the history of the nation as one master narrative. The idea of the master narrative is still present in the Norwegian history curriculum, but this has been weakened in recent reforms. Emphasis is now more on developing historical competences, the study of the uses of history, deconstructing narratives about historical events, and learning to use central concepts to analyze phenomena across time and space. The student is now encouraged to work as a researcher, and this is something that is also a trend across other subjects in our curriculum at the moment, and it is connected with the development of critical thinking skills. Awareness of narratives and multi-perspectivity are central in this way of thinking about historical learning. And this process starts, and I quote, with individual processes of historical consciousness. This is a quote taken from Kerber, Lenz, and Syse from the TeachMem project. Studying history in multicultural classes provides opportunities for comparison and articulation of identification and assumptions to raise awareness of cultural baggage, which is central to the development of critical thinking. As this is an example of a contact zone, it is both challenging and rewarding. starting from the students' pre-knowledge and making the students' pre-knowledge relevant for the learning of school knowledge is a central principle in intercultural and multicultural education. When our students in international and multicultural education participated in the history education in the Teach Mem project, they were invited to critically examine different narratives about the Second World War. Students from Denmark, Germany, Norway, Afghanistan, Nepal, and South Sudan studied the narratives presented at memorial sites and musea in Germany, Denmark, and Norway. And they learned about their own as well as other students' memory cultures and how their knowledge about historical events is filtered through different narratives. This project is an example of how intercultural history education can be developed through collaborative effort among history educators in schools, universities, musea, and memorial sites. And I will argue that teachers need to be able, what teachers need to be able to teach according to the purposes of intercultural history education and the goals of the European White Paper on Intercultural Dialogue is this kind of collaboration. As we have seen, teaching in today's schools means teaching to a multiplicity of knowledges and perspectives. To reach all students and to provide multiple perspectives and training in the study of history from a multiplicity of perspectives, teachers need access to resources and competence which they might not find among themselves or in the teaching materials that are available to them. Because of the rapid demographic and cultural changes due to migration and global interconnectedness and developments in historical research, teachers need to collaborate with experts in history and lifelong historical learning who work in institutions such as musea and memorial sites. A problem with textbooks, which teachers often depend upon to a large extent, is that they are limited in scope and often in perspectives. In my experience, teachers may rely more on the textbooks than on the curriculum. So that when I read our history education curriculum in Norway today, I find it to be quite up to date, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that the textbooks or the other resources that the teachers are using in the schools are as up to date or as progressive as the curricula are. A history textbook it is difficult, if not impossible, to reach all students and ensure multi-perspectivity by relying on one textbook, which may often be the case. A history textbook researcher has said that history curricula are like a nation's biography, narratives of what the nation wishes to be identified with, and the same can often be said about history textbooks. Challenging these narratives is often a struggle involving research to uncover taken-for-granted facts about the past and our roles in it. A recent study of descriptions of religious and ethnic minorities in Norwegian textbooks found that there are some history textbooks that connect terrorism and extremism, mostly with Muslims and Islam. That is the other. While other textbooks challenge this one-sided connection, and these are especially books written after the right-wing anti-Islam terror in Norway in 2011. Often, minority groups and the peripheries of nations are not represented in textbooks, or they are represented from the point of view of the center and the majority. Musea and memorial sites, on the other hand, often exist to represent the perspectives of historically marginalized and oppressed groups. And it is my impression that these institutions view the grand narratives differently and take care to represent a multiplicity of perspectives and are active in researching forgotten events and giving voice to people who are not often heard. And I can't think of a better example of this than the museum that we're in now. In the literacy project, which I mentioned in my introduction, And we experienced that cooperation between teachers and librarians over an extended period of time allowed for collective long-term planning of teaching programs. When librarians were invited to participate in the teachers' planning of the upcoming school year, the librarians' competence and resources helped to shape the teachers' plans, so that the teachers' plans became a lot more than just planning isolated events, such as orientation visits to the library or the teachers' ordering of book collections for the classroom. The teaching practices of the school changed because of this cooperation. In this project, the local branch of the public library was located no more than 200 meters from the school. Yet the librarians and the teachers discovered that they had never developed a closer cooperation before. They had only been organizing ritualized visits, first visits to the library for all Class 3 students to get their library cards and to be introduced to the collection. Yet these two institutions serve the same population and share a mandate of promoting literacy and empowerment and democracy. So now to my conclusion. The teaching of intercultural competences in a critical perspective require the use of rich resources, that is, history seen from a multiplicity of perspectives. School textbooks and teacher knowledge might be too limited to achieve this. Cooperating with musea and memorial places can contribute to the realization of critical intercultural history education. To learn critical thinking skills to be prepared for intercultural encounters and for the development of democracy and social justice, intercultural education needs historical competence. Thank you.
Dzień dobry, good morning. For those of you who used the privilege of the academic 15 minutes this morning and missed the introduction, let me just say I'm Sjur Bergan. I'm head of the education department at the Council of Europe, and I've been invited to comment on Kristin Skinstad van der Kooij's excellent presentation. In doing so, I'll take a slightly different track. Kristin talked about intercultural education and history teaching. I'll talk about competences for democracy and history teaching. And don't see this as an attempt to run away from the title of the conference. See it rather as a way of underlining the close connection between democracy, intercultural dialogue, and education. We can maybe put it briefly and bluntly. True intercultural dialogue is possible only in a democracy, and no society can truly be democratic if it is unable and unwilling to engage in intercultural dialogue. Neither is possible without education. So that would be my starting hypothesis. But I should declare an interest. The Council of Europe is currently working on a project developing competences for democratic culture. It was a project that was launched in late 2013 as a result of the Andorran chairmanship of our Committee of Ministers. And of course, it sadly gained urgency earlier this year after the events in Paris and then in Copenhagen. So the project will be a part of the action plan that we expect will be adopted by the Committee of Ministers meeting as the Ministers of Foreign Affairs on May 19th. The renewed urgency means greater visibility, which is great. It means higher expectations, which can be a mixed blessing. And it means a need to do more and faster, which is a challenge. Incidentally, you can contribute to this project by completing the evaluation form for this conference, because the competences that we have developed you will find on the second sheet of the evaluation form. So I could put this project into the institutional setting, recite all the plans and institutional references, but I think there are better ways of putting people to sleep, so I'll do it differently. I'll make 3 points, though, about the background for the project. The first is that the focus is on what we call democratic culture. Now, when you hear about the word democracy, what do you think about? When students in school study democracy, what do they actually study? Well, my hunch is the answer is very often institutions, laws, and procedures. Of course, you cannot have democracy if you don't have parliaments and city councils. You cannot have democracy if you don't have constitutions and laws protecting citizens. And you cannot have democracy without elections and due procedure. But even though all of these are very necessary, they will not function unless they are placed in a context in which alternative opinions are seen as natural and legitimate, unless the government can be challenged both in public debate and in elections, and unless the government be held accountable, also to the law. So in brief, institutions, laws, and procedures will not be democratic unless they build on democratic culture. Secondly, democratic culture encompasses many elements, and that includes an understanding of and respect for human rights, and the ability and will to conduct respectful dialogue with those whose background differs from ours, and who hold beliefs and convictions that we do not share. In other words, democratic culture includes human rights and intercultural dialogue, hence the link to the topic of this conference. And the third point I want to make about this project is that education plays a key role in developing and maintaining democratic culture, and both are important. You need to develop, but you also need to develop. Democratic culture is not like riding a bike or skiing. If you know it, you never quite forget it. It's really like speaking a language. If you don't practice it, you lose the ability. The role of formal education of our schools, the universities, and the education system is crucial. And of course, whether as formal, as part of formal or informal education, institutions like museums also play an important role. If you listen to public debate about education, you could be led to believe that the role of education is only to prepare for the labor market. Now, make no mistake about it. That is an important role of education. You don't need to look very far to see why this is the case. My point is rather that it's not the only purpose of education. In fact, the Council of Europe has identified 4 major roles: preparation for sustainable employment, preparation for life as active citizens in democratic societies, personal development, used to be the traditional aim of education, we just don't talk about it anymore, and the development of a broad and advanced knowledge base. The good news is that these 4 purposes are neither contradictory nor mutually exclusive. Quite to the contrary, what makes you employable can also be the kind of competencies that make you a good and active democratic citizen. Just think of 2 skills that Kristin and I are trying to demonstrate this morning: analytical ability and presentation skills. So, if we want preparation for democratic citizenship to be a major goal of education, we need to say something about what students should know, understand, and be able to do with regard to democracy at various levels of education. The triad I just mentioned, that's the traditional definition of learning outcomes. I would add a 4th element, which is attitudes. attitudes are also an important part of learning outcomes. It's not only about what we're able to do, it's also about what we're willing to do or willing to abstain from doing. There are things that we're able to do that we shouldn't do. And unless we're able to define learning outcomes for democratic culture, for the purposes of formal education, we will not succeed in making preparation for democracy a main purpose of education. So that is why the Council of Europe has set out to develop competences for democratic culture and to describe them. We have an expert group of which Claudia Lenz of the European Wergeland Center is a part. And we have developed a list that is currently of 20 competences, divided into 4 categories: values, attitudes, skills, and then knowledge and critical understanding. We're revising the descriptors now on the basis of a consultation with about 40 experts from many parts of Europe, and we will pilot this with participants in the summer academies that the Council of Europe organizes with the European Wergeland Center, as well as with the authorities of Poland and Montenegro. We'll pilot them in the postality program that Kristin mentioned, and hopefully in 1 or 2 national contexts. Georgia, for example, has volunteered. And then we'll review the results and then have a larger scale testing next year. Now, if we accept that preparing for democracy and developing the competences that we need for democratic culture is an important goal of education, where does history come into the picture? After all, our history is often the history of the failure of democracy, the failure of human rights, and the failure of intercultural dialogue. You could, of course, take the easy way out and saying that we learn from our mistakes. And in this sense, our history really provides very ample material for learning. But that's the easy way. It might be more fruitful to try to say that you can look at this from the perspective of multi-perspectivity. As some of you will know, multi-perspectivity is a key feature of the Council of Europe's education program. And the basic idea is a variation of the old saying that where you stand depends on where you sit. So your view of my history and my view of my own history may be very different. I can learn quite a bit by looking at your view of my history, and you might also learn something about by looking at my view of my history. And we could even go further in saying, my history is a part of yours, and yours is a part of mine. And I think that is very well demonstrated by our host institution, which is a museum of the history of Polish Jews, a museum of the history of Poland, but that, of course, is also a very important part of European history. Now, multi-perspectivity is sometimes misunderstood. It is not an exercise in mindless cultural relativism and moral nihilism. There are views, as well as actions, that are not acceptable. No amount of multi-perspectivity can, of course, justify the Holocaust. No amount of multi-perspectivity can justify the gulags. And of course, when it comes to the Holocaust, denying the Holocaust violates the law in many European countries, as well as the standards of history as a historical discipline, as demonstrated, for example, by the Faurisson affair in France. But when looking at the atrocities of history, we need to make a very difficult distinction between understanding and justification. We cannot justify the Holocaust. It cannot be justified. But that does not mean that we should not try to understand why the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity happened. If we do not try to understand without justifying, how can we prevent crimes against humanity for the future? Incidentally, telling the 1,000-year-long Polish-Jewish history, as our host institution does, as a history of coexistence, interaction, as well as conflict and trauma, provides multiple narratives which challenge simplification and prejudices. Now, we might tend to think of intercultural dialogue as something we carry out with those who are very different from ourselves and either come from or live far away. But history teaching can play an important role in reminding us that what separates us from others may be generations as well as kilometers. In the literal sense of the term, of course, carrying out a dialogue with past generations can be something of a challenge. But if you take dialogue less literally, history teaching can help show us that cultures are not static, and if they are, they wither away. If by miracle we were to meet some of the people who developed our own country over the centuries, we would be in dire need of intercultural dialogue. Now, if we recognize that our own culture and our countries has changed over time, how can we consider that the culture of others is immutable? By recognizing the ways in which our own cultures have changed, we can develop the competences we need to handle political differences and cultural diversity in our own times. Just take an issue like slavery. Slavery is not just a byproduct of colonizations with slaves being captured in sub-Saharan Africa and transported to the Americas and Europe. At different stages of our history, slavery was very much a part of most European societies. Slaves were sometimes foreign, sometimes not. To take my home country as an example, Vikings held slaves, but in modern Norwegian, the domestic slaves were conveniently referred to as treller, whereas the general term for slave is the same as in English, although pronounced differently, slaver. So, by using the homegrown term trell to refer to the domestic slavery, we send the message that slavery as practiced by our forefathers was different from that practiced by more recent colonial powers. And of course, those who say different here are very close to saying less bad. So studying slavery requires that we confront our own past. Until recently, in historical terms, slavery was rarely considered an anomaly and much less a moral outrage. And when the abolition movement picked up speed, it was partly for reasons of moral indignation and consideration of human dignity. It was also for economic reasons. The history of abolition is a history both of an evolving view of human beings and of economic adaptation. So the Museum of the History of Polish Jews is a very appropriate place to discuss how teaching the past today can help us prepare a better and more humane society tomorrow. Education at all levels needs to prepare for democracy as well as for the economy. And there is no inherent contradiction between the two. History education is far from marginal to this endeavor. I have often said that Europe is probably better at educating highly qualified subject specialists, and that includes historians, than we have ever been in our past. I am much less convinced that we are good at educating intellectuals. And by intellectuals, I mean the people who can take their advanced subject knowledge, and competence, and put this into a broader context. To ask the critical questions, and equally importantly, to find the answers to those critical questions. For that, we need competences for democratic culture, and that is what the Council of Europe has set out to define and to describe. And if we succeed in this, we will have education of the kind that the Canadian philosopher John Ralston Saul describes. He says, "I find our education is increasingly one aimed at training loyal employees, even though the state and the corporations are increasingly disloyal. What we should be doing is quite different. It turns on our ability to rethink our education and our public expectations so that we create a non-employee, non-loyal space for citizenship. After all, a citizen is by definition loyal to the state because it belongs to him or her. That is what frees the citizen to be boisterous, outspoken, cantankerous, and all in all, by corporate standards, disloyal. This is the key to the success of our democracy." Thank you very much.